During the Reconstruction era, the South was in turmoil, one should say, politically. Prior to the Civil War, most Southerners voted Democrat. But during the Civil War and just after the Civil War came the ascendancy of the Republican Party, or the party of Abraham Lincoln. But very few Southerners supported the Republican Party. There were a few Southerners, though, who did support the Republican Party, at least nominally. And they also took advantage of the poor conditions of their fellow Southerners. And those people are often referred to as scalawags. And we'll examine the murder of one particular man who was called a scalawag, John Walter Chicken Stevens. This is a murder that occurred in 1870, right here behind us. For this edition of Crime Chronicles, we're here in Yanceyville, North Carolina, Caswell County, just a few miles from the Virginia state line. Behind me is a statue of a Confederate soldier. Now, whether or not that statue should still be standing or not is perhaps another question for another day, another debate. But it does offer a segue into the topic we're going to cover in this segment, and that is murder that occurred in 1870 in the era of Reconstruction, just 5 years after the Civil War ended. Now, after the Civil War ended, the South was in ruins, politically, socially, economically, and Caswell County was no exception. John Walter Stevens grew up in North Carolina. He acquired the nickname Chicken, not because of cowardice, although he did pay someone to take his place to fight in the Civil War, which is very common for men of wealth in those days. He got the name because of a dispute with a neighbor in Wentworth, North Carolina. This neighbor had chickens that were always going on to Stevens' property. Stevens didn't like this, so one day he catches two chickens, kills them, takes them to the neighbor and says, "These are yours, do you want them?" And they say more or less, heck no, if you will. And so he takes the chickens home and dresses them and eats them himself. Now the neighbor swears out a warrant for Stevens for stealing his chickens. Stevens spends the night in jail, and the next day the two men meet, Ratliff, the neighbor, and Stevens, and gunfire erupts. A bystander is wounded but recovers. So that's how he got the name Chicken Stevens. Thanks to playing his cards right politically, John Walter Chicken Stevens got himself elected state senator from North Carolina, from this area I should say, and he was close allies with the Republican governor, William Holden, who was enormously unpopular in this part of the country. Stevens bore the title scalawag because he profited, if you will, or exploited the plight of his fellow Southerners. What kind of man was Stevens? The opinions are divided. Some say he was a good man, some say he was an arsonist, a thief, or that he even killed his mother, but we're not sure about that. But in any case, he was very unpopular with a significant segment of the population here in Caswell County. Among the people that didn't like John Walter Chicken Stevens were members of the Ku Klux Klan, or Ku Kluxers, as they were called in newspapers in those days. Stevens knew there were threats on his life. He took out a life insurance policy not long before he died. He even had a cage built around his bed to ward off attackers inside his home. So what got him to this point? Well, he was invited to meet with a man here that was then the Caswell County Courthouse, now a county office building, to talk about, more or less talk about politics. He was going to get this guy to switch his affiliation from the Democrat to Republican Party and run for sheriff, or at least that's why he thought he was being summoned here. But this is a Saturday evening. He thinks he's safe, even though he knows there are threats on his life. He's in the middle of town in a crowded courthouse. What can possibly happen? Well, what happened was John Walter Chicken Stevens was murdered inside the courthouse you see behind me. Well, we're standing in a place now. It's currently a meeting room for the county commissioners and county business and so forth. But in the 1870s, near the area of Reconstruction, when John Stevens was killed, this was the courthouse. It's now referred to as the old courthouse. And as you can see, it's a meeting space for county commissioners, but at one time you can also see that it was set up to be a courtroom, all right? So this is where John Stevens was lured or to talk to someone about some political matters, actually a Democrat he was going to speak to about possibly changing parties to the Republican Party and then running for sheriff. Well, that was a trap. And John Stevens was lured downstairs and murdered as a result of falling into that trap. Well, as you can see, I'm standing in a stairwell right outside what used to be the courtroom, and it's now a meeting room for county commissioners. It was either this set of steps or a similar set of steps on the other side of the room, in which John Stevens was led downstairs to his death. Well, I'm here in what used to be the Caswell County Courthouse here in Yanceyville. Now it's just office buildings. The building hasn't changed that much since it was built or since John Stevens' murder occurred in 1870. In fact, this was the room where John Stevens was killed. Now, a few things have changed. As you can probably tell, this is an employee break room now. What you really can't see very well is behind what we have right here is part of a fireplace. Now, the room that we have now is about half the size of the room that John Stevens was killed in 1870. A wall has been built dividing this room from the room next door, which used to be one much larger room. John Stevens was lured in here by the man he came to see and met by several members of the Ku Klux Klan, or Ku Kluxers as they called them very often in those days. He was pulled in here, and as you can see, this fireplace, at the time there was a bunch of wood stacked against the fireplace. After all, it was in use. That's when the killers wrapped a rope around John Stevens' neck. He begged for his life for several minutes. The man who was appointed to pull the trigger and kill John Stevens got cold feet and could not do it. He goes outside into the courthouse interior, perhaps outside the courthouse itself, and meets John Lee, the nominal head of the KKK in Caswell County, and tells him he has lost his nerve. So John Lee comes into this room. Exactly what happened, we're not sure. All we know pretty much is John Lee's account, which was finally published about 65 years after the event occurred, and about 15 or 20 years after John Lee's death. Whether that account is actually accurate, we still don't know for sure. But in any case, what we think happened, what John Lee said happened, was he came into this room, talked with John Stevens. John Stevens begged for his life. And that's when the three hatchet men, the three hitmen, if you will, tied the rope around John Stevens' neck, started to strangle him, and then stabbed him to death and or cut his throat. Well, when John Stevens did not return home, his wife became worried. And so she notified his brothers and some other men of the town, and they scoured the town looking for John Stevens. Well, John Stevens' body was still here in this room by the fireplace, or somewhere in this room, most likely by the fireplace. Problem was, it was nighttime. No one could see in this room. And even though his last reported place that he visited was here in the courthouse, they still weren't sure if this is where he disappeared, where he may have been killed and met with foul play. Well, plus the killers could not move his body, even though it was night. They had planned to move the body at nightfall, but by now the town was alerted, or some people were alerted, that John Stevens was missing. So they had no choice but to leave the body here. Well, one of the men sent to look for Stevens supposedly was an African-American resident of Caswell County and an ally of Stevens and the Republican Party. Supposedly, this man perched himself on a tree, somewhere in this vicinity, and he was able to look in and see this room, but because it was dark, he could not see Stevens' body. But as morning approached, he was able to look in and see the entire room. You see, even though we're on the first floor, this is pretty high above street level. So a person looking up into this room cannot really see into it very well. So that's why the man had to climb the tree. And sure enough, in the morning, when this room became visible, the sun came up, and there was no electricity in those days, remember, right? So that's when he saw John Stevens' body in this room. I'm now standing in the hallway outside the room where John "Chicken" Stevens was actually murdered. And the people here in Caswell County have kind of immortalized this unfortunate event with a plaque. You can't see it very well from right there, but with a plaque talking about the murder of John "Chicken" Stevens. And there's a written account of what happened. And this is a picture of what, for a long time, people thought was John Stevens. But this is not John Stevens. If you do a Google search on the name John "Chicken" Stevens, this picture will pop up. But it's not John Stevens. The fact is, we don't really know what John Stevens looked like. Here lies John Stevens, so John "Chicken" Stevens. Now, what I'm showing you is the back of the headstone, because the lighting is just too bad to show you the front, at least in this video right here. We'll show you a still in this podcast in a second. But we don't know who was paid to do this, but it says on his headstone, John Walter Stevens, doesn't say chicken, by the way, soldier, CSA, patriot. Now, which was he? Because if he were on the side of a CSA, he was not really a patriot. Fact is, John Stevens did not fight on the side of the Confederacy during the Civil War. He sat it out, paid someone to take his place, like many people did. He profited during the Civil War, and therefore that brought him up for charges, if you will, after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, the area in which he was murdered, which he was called a scalawag, or a scalawag being someone from the South who capitalized on the South's misery during the era of Reconstruction. So here lies John "Chicken" Stevens. Well, after the murders of John Stevens here in Caswell County and another murder in nearby Alamance County, Governor William Holden decided enough was enough. He had had enough of the KKK, and he had to show North Carolina who really was in charge, Governor Holden or the KKK, or at least the Piedmont area of North Carolina. And so he legally invoked martial law here in Caswell County. And he recruited 2 regiments, one from Newbern, which is composed primarily, or at least partially, of African American troops. That didn't sit very well with the townspeople. But what was even worse than that was him summoning a regiment from the western part of North Carolina, headed by a man named Kirk. This guy Kirk was known as Cutthroat Kirk for his actions during the Civil War. And he was not popular in North Carolina to begin with. In fact, even some papers who were normally friendly toward Holden and hostile toward the Klan thought it was a bad move politically, and it would only inflame tensions here in Caswell County, which it did. Kirk and his men ruled North Carolina, or at least Caswell County, more or less with an iron hand. People were detained without rights of habeas corpus. They went out of their way to be obnoxious. Sometimes soldiers would bathe openly in public in the nude. That was why we have what is can be called the Kirk-Holden War, after Governor William Holden and this former Union soldier from Tennessee and Western North Carolina, Kirk, who ruled over Caswell County with martial law. Now, eventually, the law that allowed the governor to declare martial law was declared unconstitutional. And when that happened, Kirk and his men fled for their lives from Caswell County. And it ushered in further era of Reconstruction, but also the relegation to African Americans as second-class citizens, and eventually the Jim Crow era. But the Kirk-Holden War sparked the impeachment of Governor William Holden. He was one of the first state governors actually removed from office, and it set a trend as a result of his impeachment. Other governors from other states were also impeached, and some were removed from office. So the Kirk-Holden War had implications really around the country, not just here in Caswell County and not just in North Carolina.